earth, how to tackle soaring public debt. Let me go again. Coming down to earth, how to tackle soaring public debt. This topic is really crucial. In fact, this should be one of the main topics that Nigeria should be looking at right now, even as we will soon be transiting to a new administration. This administration, the next administration, will be saddled with debt close to, over 70 trillion naira, if I'm not mistaken, or about that. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, did put up a session for how various countries can actually tackle the increasing debts that they face, which Nigeria is also part of. And I hope that from this conversation, for those of you watching, you may actually also get some insight as to perhaps why this is, why public debt has been rising in various countries. You will recall that just about 3 years ago, the whole world was on a lockdown because of COVID. As we're trying to recover from COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war hit. We're battling with the cost of living crisis around the world. So it's been one shock to another. It's been one crisis to another. So this session is about coming down to earth. How can we heave a sigh of relief? And how can we tackle the soaring public debt? So let's quickly take a break, and when we come back, you'll be getting to hear more from this session.
Here is a new and refreshing offer for our esteemed audience across the globe. The new AIT Cloud TV is an online streaming service that offers you attractive opportunities to view our rich, exciting, and entertaining programs anytime, anywhere. AIT Cloud TV is available on the web on www.ait.app, Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and Android TV. You can also download the mobile app from the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. Simply connect to the internet, download the app, register, and watch live or catch up on unlimited hours of exciting shows. AIT Cloud TV. TV on the go.
African Next West Africa Limited, in collaboration with Abuja Chamber of Commerce and Industry, press on their forthcoming event titled Advancing Technology and Communications for National Growth. Network, make new business contacts, establish international partnerships, and be inspired. Dr. Johnson Samadin Anene, the chairman of LOC iTech Expo 2023, stated that the driving force behind the event is for economic growth.
iTech Expo is an exhibition and conference on technology and communications. And this year's exhibition has the theme Advancing Technology and Communication for national economic growth. From the team, you will know that the driving force or the motivation behind this exhibition is economic growth and wealth creation. Creating wealth for the Nigerian business communities and other participants, and also contributing to our economic growth, to build our economy, make it better for everybody. And is going to come up at the International Conference Center from the 27th to the 29th of this month.
He also encouraged Nigerians to embrace technology in whatever they do.
What we have to tell Nigerians is to try to embrace technology in whatever that you do. I can remember that there was a time telephone was only for the rich, but now everybody has a telephone. Technology, whether it's ICT or normal technology, is what drives the economy and rules the world these days. And you cannot be talking about building your economy or achieving economic growth when you are not paying good attention to technology, research, and science.
Hello and welcome to the program. Thank you all for joining us today.
What we're seeing today is a bridge that we will cross together, with the young people.
Let us do what we can to making sure that our ordinary households don't fall into hunger. They can't feed themselves.
If you continue to do the same thing and expect a different result, then there's something wrong with you.
But there's a field for everyone to play, and we see a potential contribution of all partners, including local oil companies, in the short term and also in the long term.
But what we're discovering now is financial resilience matters.
This is where we keep you up to speed with everything in finance, business, markets, economy. After all, here's Moneyline with me, Nancy. So welcome again, and let's do it again today.
A press briefing was held on the 18th of April 2023 by the Rice Processors Association of Nigeria to address and provide strategies for deepening and strengthening the Nigerian rice subsector towards a more sustainable and impactful development. The Director General of the Rice Processors Association of Nigeria, Mr. Andy Ekelem, stated that there has been a drop in the importation of rice due to the President's half-stand approach against food importation.
The idea is to enable trade amongst African nations. If I produce in Nigeria, I can take it to Benin Republic, I can as far as Morocco, as long as there are things that are produced there, so that we can enable trade, grow our economy, provide jobs for Africans. But it becomes a dangerous thing when a country allows imports to their country and then dumps it, allows it to be dumped into another market. That's where the problem is, and that is why we were happy when Mr. President graciously gave an instruction to shut down the borders. It is because of this kind of malpractice that a country of maybe less than 40 million people who don't eat parboiled rice allows the import of 2 million tons of parboiled rice into their country, and before you know it, it disappears. To where? To Nigeria. It's hurting our economy, it's hurting our investment, it's hurting job development in the country.
He also stated that deliberate strategies have been put in place to encourage indigenous and foreign business concerns to invest massively in the rice value chain. With this, he urged the Nigerian government to devise new strategies in dealing with smugglers and economic saboteurs.
And we have traced the fact that security is also as a result of young minds not being positively engaged. If you don't have a job, you can't fend for yourself. You cannot take care of certain responsibilities you're supposed to take care of, and you're idle. Naturally, one will assume that crime becomes an option, which is what we don't want for the country. Which is why we are saying the incoming administration should look at this direction and begin to think of how we can address it. Yes, to safeguard our own economy and safeguard the effort of the private sector.
Welcome back. Let's quickly take you through this session, coming down to earth, how to tackle soaring public debt. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you for joining us here today for a really interesting conversation. We have some incredibly distinguished panelists with us today, and there's been a lot of attention on the issue of debt, as all of you will know. Public debt soared to a record during the pandemic. It's come down from there, but as we learned in the Fiscal Monitor release today and in the WEO, it will be reaching once again roughly 100% of GDP in 2028, which is the end of the IMF forecast horizon. So there's a lot of questions about that, but there are also questions about what the impact is on emerging markets and developing economies. And there was a meeting that just ended shortly before this session of the newly created Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which took place here in this building and included for the first time not just the creditors and a broader range of creditors, but also included debtor countries. So and private sector actors, as well as the international financial institutions. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at some of the macroeconomic issues and concerns that have been raised about public debt levels. And we'll be looking very specifically at what can be done to reduce debt levels smoothly and without disruption. So without further ado, we introduce our panelists. We have Ceyla Bazarbeoglu, who is the Director of Strategy at the IMF. We have we have Felix Nkulukusu, who is the Secretary of the Treasury of Zambia, and whose finance minister also just took part in that debt roundtable. So we'll be really interested to hear the perspective of Zambia. We have Marco Butti, who's joining us. He's the head of cabinet for the European Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni at the European Commission and has been deeply involved in the EU's process of working on fiscal reforms. And last, but certainly not least, we have Pierre-Olivier Gurinches, who's the director and economic counselor of the research department at the IMF. So thank you very much. Ceyla, I always ask you tough questions. So you've just come from this debt roundtable. Can you give us a readout on what happened and whether the actual accomplishments that a U.S. official expected happened, and whether, just give us a little bit of a readout.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and it's great to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues. So yes, it was a very constructive meeting. The Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, we just had the meeting of the ministers, and as Andrea explained, it's basically a platform that brings together borrowers, creditors, both official as well as private sector creditors, as well as the private sector, as well as the IMF and the World Bank. So it's co-chaired by Kristalina, by David Malpass, as well as Minister Nirmala, the G20 presidency this year. So this was a very constructive meeting. We had, as I mentioned, debtor countries, Zambia, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Ecuador, Ghana, all the ministers were there. We also had Paris Club representative, France was there, Japan, US, the UK, as well as IIF, ICMA, Standard and Chartered, BlackRock, and as I said, co-chaired by the three. So it was a very good discussion. The idea here is not to replicate the discussions that take place at the creditor coordination fora, like for Zambia, for Sri Lanka. Those are for country-specific cases where creditors get together and discuss the debt treatment. The Global Debt Roundtable is more to reach consensus on key concepts and key issues. And in this context, we discussed issues that you have seen in the press, that you have seen as key issues that we need to make progress. These are comparability of treatment. These include the role of MDBs, including information sharing, exchange of our DSAs, and so on. So those were the topics that were discussed, but you will hear more over the coming days. But I would like to just end by saying it was a very constructive meeting where everyone acknowledged the need for reaching consensus, having a constructive discussion, because the countries that do need debt treatment need it urgently. And I think that's understood by everyone in that room.
That's very positive to hear. I think that's a good moment to ask Felix to weigh in. As one of the three original countries that requested treatment under the common framework, can you say what you, and sorry, just the common framework, to the extent that people are not aware, was set up by the group of 20 major economies to help especially low-income countries get through the pandemic. So initially there was a debt suspension initiative that froze debt payments, created a moratorium in the early days of the pandemic. And then as it became clear that the pandemic was having a more significant impact, I think the common framework was born, which for the first time brought together China as the largest bilateral sovereign creditor, together with the lenders and other countries as well, but lenders with the Paris Club creditors. And it was set up with the intention of helping a number of countries, quite a large number of countries, sort of get through a debt restructuring process more quickly. And that has really just not happened. The pace of restructurings has been very slow. There have been a lot of impediments. But I'm curious from your perspective, what you think, what is Zambia's need at this point? Maybe just tell us a little bit about what happened when you first applied.
Thank you very much. So the journey to common framework for Zambia started in February 2021. And at that time, we looked at our macroeconomic to restructure our economy. And on the basis of that program, then we had discussions. We started discussing with the IMF for a program. And in July 2021, we then officially applied for on a common framework arrangement. We then went through the process And in December 2021, we put all the macros together. We had discussions with the IMF mission, and we had a staff level agreement. And following the staff level agreement, we needed to have financing assurances that would then be able to allow the IMF to support Zambia on the ECF program. That took a bit of some time, and we got the financing assurances finally in July 2022, and we had the program approved in August. And since August 2022, we still are discussing and going through the processes of having a memorandum of understanding with the creditors. And what this means to Zambia is that we have an economic program that we said is an important element into the reform that we're undertaking. And on the economic program, we are achieving what we need to do. But we have the other component, the second component, which is the debt restructuring, that should complement the economic program that we are undertaking in order to realize, to get the dividends that Zambia needs to get. And there is a delay in this process. Obviously, this delay in this process have got the downside effects on the country. One of the downside effects is that it signals some challenges that then the Zambian stakeholders, the population would start questioning what the government is doing. The second challenge that we have is that when we had this agreement and the financing assurances way back in July, the understanding was that we are going to have the second review that the IMF would be able to take. And under this second review, there will be the assurances from the creditors in terms of the memorandum of understanding. And all things being equal, then we put that and built that into our budget 2023. Given that this has not happened, it therefore has got a significant impact on how we implement this. And the resources that we are getting from the IMF are resources targeted at having intervention, particularly in the social sector, in the education sector. For the first time in a long period of time, Zambia managed to recruit teachers to reduce the teacher-pupil ratio in the schools and therefore have a good education system. Zambia managed to recruit health workers to make sure that there is health service provision that is going to the people of Zambia. We managed to enhance the social cash transfer to make sure that there is an impact and an intervention on the poor that normally get affected with the reform that we're undertaking. If this money doesn't come, if the process delays, it means that all these achievements that we have achieved so far may go into despair. But what is even more important is that as we are undertaking this, and we have got these sentiments and this indication from our partners, the stakeholders in the country, we managed to have some economic stability. Inflation was stable, exchanges was stable, and the growth started picking up from the pandemic era. What we see now, because of the sentiments in the market, is that we may start losing some of the gains that we have achieved so far, especially on the macroeconomic front. And if we start losing some of those achievements that we have received so far on the macroeconomic front, then we'll have some despair or some pushback from the stakeholders that have been waiting and supporting us as we undertook all these reforms that were homegrown, most of which where we are talking about expenditure alignment, removal of subsidies on fuel, on electricity, and making sure that we put the money in good use. And this is the challenge we have, and this is where we talk about the common framework, probably to deliver immediately before we lose the macroeconomic parameters that we achieved.
Are you at all encouraged by what's happened? I mean, the noises that have happened over the past few days, we've heard U.S. officials, we've heard David Malpass from the World Bank, and also Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF talk about China's agreement to participate in and to offer specific and credible financing assurances in the case of Sri Lanka. That is something that is seen as, providing perhaps additional momentum for the common framework process. Just very briefly, do you see any glimmer of hope in terms of moving this on? And if so, how quickly can this memorandum of understanding be signed?
Of course, we are encouraged with the interventions that have taken place. We are encouraged with the discussions that we are having with the stakeholders. We are also encouraged that we have the IMF high delegation team that has been involved and have been discussing with the stakeholders to be able to achieve a solution to this. Our belief, our hope is that the solution will be achieved sooner rather than later. And that some of the experiences that we have faced and some of the challenges that we see in the common framework will be a lesson learned from the Zambia experience as we refine some of these challenges going forward, so that the countries that will come following the Zambia footstep will not have this long wait before they put in place the structures that need to be put in place and therefore deliver the common framework.
Yes, thank you. Pierre-Olivier, I want to ask you, the IMF has done quite a lot of research and work on the overall problem of public debt. Can you say a few words now about this elevation that we see coming again, right? So there's been a decline, the biggest, steepest decline in 70 years in 2021 and 22 in public debt, but it looks like the trend is going up. What does that mean? What are the consequences and risks associated with high levels of public debt?
Well, yes, I'd be very happy to talk about this. It's absolutely true. So we had, as you mentioned, public debt peaking in 2020 around 100%. And then in the 2 years after that, it's been coming down a little bit. And some of it has been, in fact, the fact that we had, of course, a surge in unexpected inflation that has increased nominal income. Let's not forget that this will tend to have an effect on debt to GDP ratios. And there's been also some consolidation taking place as some of the very extensive measures that were put in place to protect populations and businesses in many countries after the pandemic were starting to be pulled back. But going forward, we do see this increase again in public debt on the back of rising interest rates and slowing growth in the world economy. We had our economic projections released yesterday, and we do see a relatively low growth going forward. And not just this year and next year, we also anticipate that there might be a little bit less in terms of growth momentum when we look 5 years out at our forecast horizon. And that, of course, makes debt dynamics a little bit more challenging for many countries. Now, what we have done in one of the analytical chapters of our World Economic Outlook, Chapter 3, was to try to take stock of countries' experience in trying to tackle elevated debt levels and try to bring them down to more manageable levels. Now, of course, you could always say, well, if there is enough growth, the problem will take care of itself. True, but you don't magic growth. You just don't. You can do a lot of things that will put in place the conditions where growth can happen, but it's not something that you control directly. So effectively what we look at in the chapter is we look at the contribution of different forces to debt reduction over time and how successful different types of policies have been in trying to reduce public debt. And growth does definitely play a role in bringing down elevated debt levels. But we can also look at fiscal consolidation, which is the effort that policymakers would take to increase revenue collection or reduce expenditures. And here,
cutting back the very spending that Felix is just talking about, right?
Exactly. Well, but let me come to that. So that's one direction. Certainly, you could try to bring down your debt levels by trying to reduce the level of expenditures, fiscal expenditures, or increase revenues, which in many countries is an important avenue for reducing debt, is revenue mobilization. It's something that we've been advocating at the fund for a long time, that a lot of countries can increase their infrastructure in terms of tax collection and work that way. But what we find is sort of a nuanced message, and it's a message that we've been articulating in our report. The first thing is that it's difficult. It's difficult because, for the reason you mentioned, when you do a fiscal consolidation, it will tend to weigh down on growth by itself. It will have a contractionary effect on growth, and if you have lower growth, you also have lower tax revenues, etc. So it affects both it makes it harder on your numerator and makes it harder on the denominator. And if you just look at the universe of fiscal consolidation episodes, well, the message is not really uplifting. We find that it works in just a little bit more than 50% of the cases. So should we just conclude that it doesn't work? No, that's not the conclusion that we reach in our chapter. What we find is that these fiscal consolidation efforts, they need to be tailored in the right way. They need to be thought through very, very carefully. It's not a mechanistic approach. They work better, of course, if you are in an environment in which you have underlying growth, either at home or in the rest of the world. That helps. They also work better in situations where you have very elevated debt levels to start with. And that's an important message here because, in effect, this is a little bit like a crowding out effect. If you reduce debt in an environment in which public debt is very high, you free up resources in the private sector, and that also can help stabilize debt levels at much lower levels. And then finally, they work much better when they're accompanied by other types of reforms that are growth enhancing. So you shouldn't think about just the fiscal side, but you think about the growth side at the same time. And what we find is that when you put these different ingredients together, then you have a much, much higher chance of success. And so that's a first layer through which you can think about trying to bring down your debt levels. So complicated, tough, doesn't mean that you necessarily have a lot of other options. So let's make sure we design it in the right way when we want to do it, when we have to do it.
We talk a lot about low-income countries and heavily indebted countries, but Europe has had its own problems with debt over the last decades, and you are now in Brussels trying to address that. I'd like to ask you to explain what's happening there and what you think the outcome will be, and whether there's any hope of getting those widely disparate sort of debt ratios within the European community into some kind of better equilibrium. But before we go to that, I want to ask you both, Pierre and Marco, to also reflect on the impact of the financial strains on this entire discussion. Right? So we have an economy that's slowing, where growth is not great. Interest rates are high, the cost of borrowing is high, and on top of it now, we have potentially a credit squeeze and potentially, worse consequences.
Yes, no, thank you very much for the invitation. Great to be here. Let me first rebound on what Pierre-Olivier said before, because I advise to everybody to read the WEO. In general, it's always it's a very instructive reading, particularly chapter 3, which is the topic we are discussing today. And I think there it's a very sober, very deep analysis, courageous also from certain viewpoints, and very relevant for Europe also. I mean, we have deployed an unprecedented fiscal support during the COVID pandemic. We have basically suspended the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, the fiscal rules that we have, and we started actually before COVID and then throughout COVID to think about how to reinstate rules, but rules that work. And the experience in Europe is that not always what we had in place actually was fit for purpose. And
was the rule was 60%, right? A 60% debt ratio.
I think there
debt to GDP.
Yeah, I think what we have is that what is recognizable, what is visible. You ask everybody in the street, maybe here, even here in Washington, that has a bit of a magnetic power and orientates the choices of policymakers. So I think we are not going to change that. Also because we know that, in order to change the 3%, one would need to go through a process of ratifying a new treaty with, unanimity in ratification in national parliaments. Let's not go into that, because we'll never come back to the real problems. And I think it's useful to orientate the choices. The rest, I think, has to be rethought. And if I take the lessons that are drawn and briefly summarized by Pierre-Olivier here in chapter 3, you correct me, but I would summarize in 5 points what chapter 3 says, and I would like to see whether what we are thinking about and we are going to propose in a few weeks is actually consistent with the lessons you draw there. So basically, for fiscal consolidations to be successful, 5 points. They have to be adequately timed, appropriately designed, moderate but sustained adjustment, accompanied by growth in enhancing structural reforms, and finally, backed by strong institutional framework, medium-term oriented. So maybe I think I try to capture the essence.
You did
the essence. So that is there. And if I take this filter here and I use the screening of what we are going to propose, what we have announced already, I would say that by and large, thumb up in what, we on the adequately timed, at the end of the day, one of the problems that we have faced with the current suspended framework has been procyclicality. So, this is a law of human nature. We misbehave in good times. You think about your personal experience, I'm sure we have all this type of, so it's not only, so we have to run against these temptations, but certainly, we did not consolidate in particular in good times. And we did not have then the room for maneuver in bad times, and so we err on the wrong side on both good times and bad times. So we are going to have a system which is less pro-cyclical, more anti-cyclical, focusing on, net expenditure, and having also overall and country-specific suspension clauses, escape clauses, when things get very bad. Second, appropriately designed. I think here what we are trying to do is to provide the incentives for structural reforms and also to put the money where your mouth is, in particular on investment, climate, etc. So there we are going to do that by having the possibility for countries who do the right reforms and allocate the money to the good causes to have a longer adjustment period, so from 4 to 7 years. I think moderate but sustained consolidation. I think here the simulations that we have done based on our debt sustainability analysis of the adjustment that would underpin this comes actually very, very close to your 0.4%, which you have in the WAO. So by and large, you are on that point also, accompanied by growth in enhancing structural reform, I've just said, and I think strong institutional framework. And here we are going to strengthen the directive which govern the national frameworks to make, which has created independent fiscal councils so that you have a stronger national. So I would say overall, I think we are going to meet the requirements of the fund. I hope the fund acknowledges that when we come forward with the proposal. And overall, I think the key element in all this, and I think it spans across developing countries, advanced economies, is the need of strong ownership. I don't think magic numbers plunging from Brussels to the national capitals will do the job. I said about the 3%. This is, a bit iconic also, but otherwise it is important to have strong national ownership. So what we foresee is the possibility for member states within a common framework to come forward with national programs with their own adjustment profile, and once that has been discussed with the Commission, adopted by all the member states in the Council, in the European Council, I think it would be easier, to enforce the rules because it would reflect what member states themselves have come forward with and not being imposed.
Intriguing. We've only got about 10 minutes left. So we've talked about a really broad range of things that are all connected. And, we've talked about the kind of external factors that are out there. I want to ask you a question that may have a simple answer, which is, we're entering in an era now where inflation is higher, interest rates are going to be higher again. Is this an era where public debt is just going to be higher? The historic levels of public debt were lower. We saw them go up, trend up, come back down a little bit just in the last couple of years. Is it just something that the global economy is going to get used to, having higher levels of debt, having higher interest rates, and having, higher inflation? Is that just what we should be preparing for, given all of the costs that are out there, given the mammoth trillions of dollars that are required to address the common challenges, climate change, fragility, future pandemics, war? Spending needs are high for countries both in advanced economies but also in emerging markets. So is there a shift that has to happen? I'm looking at you, Pierre.
Well, I can certainly take a crack at it, but it's an important question. It's a difficult question. I think there are two parts to it. One part to it is we have to ask ourselves where we think sort of where the equilibrium interest rate is going to be relative to the growth rate. I think that we know that conditions a lot of what is sustainable in terms of debt level at the end of the day. And there are concerns on the growth side, I've already mentioned. There are maybe the news are not as concerning when we look at the interest rate side. And what I mean by this, that's another chapter of the World Economic Outlook where we ask ourselves, where do we see the neutral real rate going? It's been trending down for decades now. And, now interest rates are high, but in part this is because central banks are also dealing with this inflation problem. Where would we go after that? And just to make it short, the chapter dives deep into the potential drivers. Two of the main ones are the demographics. They are leading to more saving, in a sense, that's one way to think about it, with longer lifespans and slowdown in population growth. And then technology, which is also affecting growth, but is sort of slowing down and also helping on the interest rate side. So why does it matter? Well, with a lower real rate, you can sustain potentially higher levels of debt and not be in a situation that is problematic. Although it means that whenever interest rate changes, things can change very quickly as well. So there is an element of non-linearity here, if you want. So that's sort of the background, if you want. And then on top of that, you have the challenges that you've mentioned. We have to think about how to ensure climate transition, energy security for many countries. There might be an increase in defense spending for some countries that may have to think looking ahead and think that they have to ensure their own safety in that space. And so you could have increase in public expenditures, and that would require more debt, so that could change some of the calculations. That WEO chapter we did looked at some of these forces, for instance the effect of the climate transition. And it does two things. You need more investment in green technologies. That is pushing up interest rates. That's making it harder for that to be sustained. But it also means less brown investment. And so there's a question of timing, but at the end of the day, it's not clear. It changes the picture very dramatically, at least in the simulations that we had. So lots of uncertainty around this. But right now, I mean, what I would say is if we indeed have an environment where real rates were to revert back to around 1% or so where they were before, that would allow that would create a lot more space for governments to be doing things and the kind of things they need to do.
Marco, from the perspective of the European Union, which has been also a big creditor and helper for the emerging markets, what do you think, how do you see this evolving? I mean, how important to you is it that the, situation of the emerging markets also is addressed? I know you're talking about cleaning your own house and improving behavior, in Europe, but, what's the, when I worked in Europe, I heard the Germans often say, Africa is our backyard, right? Like, it's like we have to be attentive to these concerns that affect many African countries because of migration patterns, but just because of proximity. Does it raise the stakes for you?
It is clear that the geopolitical situation is shifting very rapidly. One of the things I've been thinking about Europe, deeply convinced about now for a while, is that one cannot separate our domestic agenda from our global one. The two are, they are strictly interconnected. And for a complex animal like the European Union, rejoining domestic and global agenda is very challenging. And we have different bodies discussing different issues, etc. And sometimes the strategic perspective does not filter through in a clear manner. But if we think about in a world in which there are re-emerging trade-offs, in a sense, if you, and I'm stranding a bit outside your question, but if you think about, go back to spring 2020, what we needed to do at the time, I'm thinking about Europe in particular, was hard politically, because we had to, we devised at the time Next Generation EU, so the common response, issuing common debt, etc. So politically very hard. But from the economic viewpoint, it was banal. It was not difficult. There were no trade-offs. Okay, you remember you had still inflation well below the ECB target, so 1%, and we're talking about the effective lower bound for monetary policy. We had the lockdowns, so growth collapsing, and what you had to do there at the time was you expand throughout all the means that you had, fiscal, monetary, and etc. A couple of years later, where trade-offs are actually haunting us again. So you have trade-offs, it is clear, on the stagflation between sustaining growth and taming inflation. You have trade-off on normalization of monetary policy and the issue of financial fragmentation, the risks, and here in Europe also, TPI and etc. You have the trade-offs between different concepts of sustainability, social, environmental, fiscal, so how you combine all this, and thinking about the global agenda, you have the efficiency versus security trade-off. There one would want to have, from the efficiency viewpoints, long value chains, but we know we are in a world where, talking about reshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring, so these are the buzzwords of the day, where you want maybe you're tempted to maybe sacrifice a bit of efficiency in order to gain more security. We talk in Europe about open strategic autonomy. So all this is hard, and you need to interconnect the two elements. I think one thing that we have learned over the past couple of years, we have to be very modest as institutions, policymakers, etc., because reversibility of trends is behind every corner. Sure. I mean, we are talking here, not long ago, low for long. It looked as if it was very long, and now we are facing, inflation surging and very difficult situation. So, if you go, please, okay.
We're just about out of time. Felix, I want to ask you, picking up on what Marco said about fragmentation. So, there is growing concern about the world kind of breaking into two camps, right? Sort of the West and then, another sort of track of economies, China, Russia, others. From where you sit, do you see that as a danger? Or do you see that as something that perhaps a country like Zambia could benefit from? Could you, where do you see the role of countries in Africa in this new, more difficult global economy?
Yeah, in one of the discussions that I had with the cooperating partner groups in Zambia, I did make mention to the fact that if we have two elephants fighting, normally the grass that suffers. So when you bring in this global geopolitics, Zambia in this case is the grass, and the one that suffers is Zambia. And we saw some discussions that were going out when we had some high-level visits, and there was the discussion of the West saying that probably China is delaying the process, sometimes not mentioning the name. China coming on board and saying, no, we are not delaying the process, it's the West. And in the meeting that we had with the cooperating partners, my advice to them was that if we have got a problem, let's resolve it, not in the media, but in the room. And if there is someone who is not coming to be part of the process, let's have that discussion in the room. Let's open up. And because of that, we also had an initiative as a country. We went to China and sat down with the Chinese and said, if you are saying that there's some delays in responses or there are some additional information that you require and that is not coming, we are the people that are affected. Please send that information to us. And if we have to get that information from the IMF, we'll go to the IMF and ask that we get that information immediately. And what we have seen so far, and this is why I'm expressing the hope that she has expressed, what we have seen so far is that there is this exchange of information and there is this willingness to engage and to find a solution. So we think that probably if we engage and find a solution, we'll be able to reach that hope that has been talked about. Thank you.
We've come to the end of the program. Thank you all for watching. I am Nancy Naji. Don't forget to always be the best you can be and be the change that you want to see. I will see you all again next time.